The man lived in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where everyone kept to themselves and life moved at a slow, predictable pace. His house was modest but neat, a little garden in front, flowers carefully arranged along the walkway, and a porch that caught the afternoon sun just right. From the outside, he looked like any other man in the neighborhood. He mowed his lawn regularly, greeted neighbors politely when he saw them, and kept a routine that most people would call ordinary. Inside, his life was simple. He worked during the day, cooked his meals with care, and spent evenings reading or watching old documentaries. There were small signs of a life once filled with something much different: medals tucked away in a drawer, framed pictures of places he had been, things most people wouldn't understand at first glance. But he never talked about them. Most people in the neighborhood didn't even know he had a past that was extraordinary. To them, he was just a quiet, respectful man who kept to himself. Even though life seemed peaceful, there was an undercurrent of tension. The neighborhood had changed over the years. Families moved in and out, and not everyone shared the same values. Occasionally, graffiti would appear on walls, words scrawled carelessly but loaded with meaning. Sometimes he would hear harsh, cutting remarks as he walked past certain houses. People who were supposed to be neighbors showed hostility, not friendliness. At first, he ignored it. He had learned long ago that picking battles carefully was the key to survival. One evening, he sat on his porch, sipping a cup of tea, and watched the sun dip behind the trees. Children laughed in the distance, neighbors called out to each other, and everything seemed calm. But his eyes were sharp. He noticed small things: a car parked a little too long on the corner, shadows moving in ways that didn't make sense, a piece of trash left deliberately on his lawn. Most people wouldn't have noticed, but he did. Years of training had taught him to pay attention to details others would miss. He remembered a time when he was younger, before the quiet life, when every second mattered. Life back then was about survival, precision, and trust. He didn't often think about it, not unless necessary, but memories would surface sometimes: a mission gone wrong, a close call, the feeling of being responsible for the safety of others. Those memories shaped him. They made him careful, disciplined, and aware that the world was not always as it seemed. That night, as he prepared for bed, he noticed something unusual. His front gate had a small scratch, like someone had tried to force it open. He frowned but didn't panic. He locked the doors, checked the windows, and went to sleep as usual. In the morning, the scratch was gone, or maybe it had just faded in the sunlight. But the unease remained. He was not a man who jumped to conclusions, but he had learned to trust instincts, and his instincts told him something was coming. The next few days were quiet on the surface, but he noticed small signs that made him alert. Neighbors acted differently around him, some avoiding eye contact, others whispering when he passed by. There were rumors he overheard accidentally, words about someone not belonging, sending a message, and teaching him a lesson. He didn't confront anyone. Confrontation was rarely necessary if you could observe and prepare. Then it happened. One afternoon, as he returned home from work, he saw his front yard destroyed. The garden was trampled, flowers ripped out, trash thrown across the lawn. The gate was broken, windows had cracks running across the glass, and his mailbox was bent beyond repair. His heart remained steady. Most people would panic, call the police immediately, or shout at the neighbors. He did none of that. He walked slowly through the debris, noting every detail: the direction the trash was thrown, the footprints in the soil, marks on the walls. Each sign told a story if you knew how to read it. The destruction was not random. It was deliberate. It carried a message, and he understood exactly what kind of people would do something like this. Racism, hatred, and ignorance had been the driving force behind the attack. People who thought they could intimidate him because of the color of his skin. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. For hours, he worked silently. He cleaned what he could, repaired small things, and documented everything carefully: pictures, notes, observations. He didn't just clean, he analyzed. Who had done this? How many? What weapons or tools had they used? Were they likely to return? His mind moved quickly, calculating possibilities and preparing contingencies. To any outsider, it would have looked like he was just tidying up after a storm. But inside his mind was a strategic battlefield. Neighbors watched him from behind curtains, some with curiosity, others with fear. No one dared approach him. They had seen his quiet strength over the years, his ability to remain calm even in strange situations. Something about him commanded respect without a word, and that was exactly how he liked it. He didn't need to announce his abilities. People would learn in time if necessary. That night he sat down with a notebook. He wrote down observations, patterns, and thoughts about possible motives. He recalled past experiences, situations where careful observation and patience had saved lives. He knew that reacting with blind anger would be foolish. Precision and timing were everything. For now he would gather information, prepare, and wait. Even though he had faced countless dangers in his past, this situation was different. It was personal. The attack on his home was an attack on his sanctuary, on the life he had built carefully. And yet he did not allow anger to cloud his judgment. He understood the psychology of fear, intimidation, and aggression. Those who attacked him believed they had power, that they could shake him. He let them believe that for now, all while planning his next steps. Over the following days, he noticed other signs of hostility. Cars parked suspiciously, strangers watching from a distance, messages left where they knew he would find them. Each act was a test, a challenge. But he was ready. He had been ready for a long time, even if the people in the neighborhood had no idea. He had trained his mind and body for extreme situations, and now those skills would quietly come to life if necessary. He spent time reinforcing his home, securing windows, doors, and entry points. But he also prepared mentally. He visualized scenarios, planned responses, and anticipated potential mistakes. This was not paranoia, it was preparation. And preparation had always been his strength. Through all of this, he maintained his calm exterior. To neighbors, he was the same man who waved politely, mowed his lawn, and kept a quiet home. Inside, however, a storm of focus and strategy was brewing. He had learned long ago that appearances could deceive. People judged by what they saw, but real strength and danger often hid beneath a quiet surface. By the end of the first week, it was clear that the attacks were not random. Someone or some group had targeted him specifically, and while others might have been terrified, he felt something else. A quiet determination. He would not allow hatred to take his home, his peace, or his dignity, and if those who attacked him thought they understood who he was, they were gravely mistaken. As night fell, he sat on his porch again, looking out at the quiet street. He sipped his tea, eyes scanning for anything unusual. He thought about the future, about the challenges ahead, and about the skills he had honed over a lifetime. He didn't fear what was coming. He was ready. And though the neighborhood saw only a quiet man, something far more formidable lay beneath. Something they could never have anticipated. The first part of this story ends with that quiet tension, a sense that life is about to change. The man's ordinary world has been disrupted, but he is far from ordinary. Patience, discipline, and awareness have always been his allies, and soon those allies would become instruments of action, showing that the man they thought was ordinary was anything but. The days following the attack passed slowly, each moment carrying a tension that weighed heavily in the air. The quiet neighborhood, which once felt safe, now seemed to whisper with a hidden menace. The man moved carefully through his home, every sound making him pause and listen. Doors creaked in the distance, a car engine idled too long on the street, and shadows sometimes shifted where they shouldn't. He noticed it all, his senses tuned sharply to even the smallest anomaly. One evening, as he returned from work, he noticed fresh footprints in the garden. They were deliberate, heavy, and seemed to circle the house as if testing boundaries. He crouched low, examining the soil, counting the steps, noting the depth and direction. To any casual observer, it was just a man inspecting his yard. But in his mind, it was intelligence gathering, learning patterns, and predicting movements. Whoever had done this thought they were intimidating him. They had no idea they were observing a trained mind. The next attack came without warning. A group of men arrived, moving swiftly, vandalizing his property even further. They broke the remaining windows, scattered furniture, and left messages on the walls that were meant to instill fear. They shouted hateful words as they left, thinking that fear would be enough to control him. Most people in the neighborhood would have panicked, called the police repeatedly, or even left their homes in terror. But he did none of that. He observed. He memorized. He planned. Inside, he moved silently, inspecting the damage. He noticed the smallest details, the angle at which the furniture was thrown, the type of tire tracks left in the soil, even the smell of the spray paint they had used. Every clue was a piece of a puzzle. He began to piece together the possible number of people, their habits, and their potential weaknesses. Each movement, each action by the gang told him more about their capabilities. He started preparing his home in subtle ways, reinforcing doors, placing locks where there were none, securing windows, and checking every entry point. But these preparations were more than just physical. He also worked on mental strategies, running simulations in his mind. What if they returned at night? What if there were more than they seemed? How could he defend without putting innocent neighbors at risk? Every scenario played out in his head with precision. Despite the intensity of the situation, he maintained a calm exterior. He greeted neighbors politely, mowed his lawn, and carried on with everyday tasks. But inside there was a focused energy, a readiness that could not be seen. The gang had no idea that the quiet, polite man they targeted was far from ordinary. They assumed fear and intimidation would work. They were wrong. One afternoon, he noticed a car parked down the street for hours. Its windows were tinted, but the engine was on, and it shifted slightly now and then. Most people would have ignored it, called the police, or simply gone inside. He watched it quietly, noting the license plate, the angles of observation, and the timing of the movements. His military training allowed him to analyze situations like this calmly and without panic. He also began gathering evidence, discreetly documenting everything. Photographs, videos, notes, sketches, everything would be useful later. He was building a case not just for himself, but in case law enforcement became involved. He understood that actions taken in anger could be dangerous. Restraint was part of his strength. He could wait, plan, and act decisively when the moment was right. As the days passed, the gang grew bolder. They left threatening notes, painted messages on walls, and even tried to confront him directly in the street. But each time he handled the encounters with calm, measured responses. He did not show fear, nor did he provoke them unnecessarily. Instead, he used the encounters to observe, to learn more about their numbers, their coordination, and their behavior. Neighbors began to whisper. Some were curious, some were afraid, and a few wondered if he was capable of defending himself. They could see the changes in the neighborhood, the tension in the air, and the way he moved with quiet purpose. Yet they did not know the full truth. They saw only a disciplined, controlled man. They could not imagine the depths of his skills, nor the life he had lived before moving to this quiet suburb. One night he stayed up late, sitting at the edge of his porch, listening to the sounds of the street. There were whispers in the wind, distant footsteps, and the occasional car passing too slowly. He visualized every possible scenario, how the gang might approach, what tactics they might use, and how he could counteract them. It was not fear that kept him alert, but strategy. He understood that preparation was the key to control. He also thought about the people behind the attacks. They were motivated by ignorance and hatred, thinking that violence and fear could give them power over someone they judged unfairly. They had no idea that he had lived through situations far more dangerous than anything they could conjure. He had been trained to remain calm under pressure, to act with precision, and to protect those who could not protect themselves. And now the skills that had been dormant in this quiet life were starting to stir. The first night that the gang attempted to confront him directly was a turning point. They thought they could intimidate him with loud voices, aggressive posturing, and threats. He stood calmly, hands at his sides, observing every movement. His eyes followed them like a predator studying its prey. Every twitch, every glance, every unsteady step told him more about their confidence and their weaknesses. They expected fear. What they found was composure and quiet readiness. He did not attack. That was not the time. Instead, he used his presence to send a subtle warning. His stance, his unwavering gaze, and the deliberate calm in his voice communicated something without words. He was not to be underestimated. The gang left, confused and unsettled. They thought they had the upper hand, but the tables were slowly turning. In the days that followed, he refined his preparations. He installed cameras, strengthened weak points, and continued documenting everything. But beyond the physical changes, he also sharpened his mental strategies. He mapped out escape routes, possible traps, and ways to gather intelligence without being noticed. He understood that intelligence and patience were more powerful than brute force alone. Despite the rising tension, he continued living his life with care and attention. He worked, cooked, and maintained his home, but each action carried purpose. Every step, every glance, every small routine was layered with observation and awareness. To anyone else, it might have seemed like an ordinary life continuing. To him, it was a delicate balance of daily normalcy and tactical readiness. The neighborhood's reactions added another layer to the situation. Some people avoided him, sensing the quiet tension around his house. Others tried to offer advice, but he politely declined. He didn't need interference. This was his problem to solve on his terms. The gang had underestimated him, and he would make sure they realized that their assumptions were dangerously wrong. Then, one afternoon, he spotted a new development. A group of people was lingering near the corner, watching him from a distance. Their posture, their whispers, and the way they moved together suggested planning. They were organized more than he had initially thought. But he did not panic. He observed, noted details, and began constructing a response. He knew exactly how to turn observation into action when the time came. The next morning, he walked through his home, checking doors and windows once more. Each lock, each barricade, and each camera was in place. But more importantly, his mind was ready. He was ready to act if necessary, to defend himself and to teach the intruders a lesson they would never forget. But action would be deliberate, precise, and controlled. Nothing would be wasted, nothing left to chance. Even in these tense days, he found moments of reflection. He thought about his life, the skills he had learned, and the discipline that had shaped him. He considered the nature of fear, hate, and ignorance, and the ways people assumed power over others. He understood their mistakes. They saw the surface, not the depths below. They did not know that calm could hide strength, patience could hide power, and observation could lead to total control of a situation. By the end of this second part of the story, the stage was set for confrontation. The man was prepared, calm, and aware. The gang had escalated, confident in their misguided belief that intimidation could achieve their goals. But they had underestimated him. Every observation, every note, every calculated move had brought him closer to a position of advantage. He waited not with fear but with purpose, knowing that when the time came he would act decisively. And in that quiet, tense neighborhood, a dangerous calm settled over his home. To anyone else, it might have seemed ordinary. To him, it was the perfect preparation. He knew that the gang's next move would be crucial. And when it came, they would discover that the man they thought they could scare was far more formidable than they ever imagined. The quiet tension that had been building in the neighborhood reached a new level. The man had spent weeks observing, preparing, and planning, and now he could feel the shift in the air. The gang had grown bolder with each passing day, and it was clear they were planning something larger, more aggressive. Their actions were no longer random. They were organized, deliberate, and fueled by the assumption that he was just a quiet, ordinary man. It started one evening as he returned home from work. The street was unusually still, the kind of stillness that made him tense instantly. He noticed shadows moving behind the trees and cars parked in ways that blocked his view of the street corners. The gang had set a stage, and he could sense it. He didn't panic. Instead, he slowed his steps, observing, noting every detail: the angle of light, the direction of the wind, even the sounds in the distance. Every little thing could be a clue. Every small detail could be a signal of their plan. Inside, he moved quietly, checking every entry point again. Doors, windows, vents, and even small gaps along the walls. Everything had to be secure. His movements were precise, deliberate. It was as if every muscle in his body had a memory of situations far more dangerous than a gang of local troublemakers. He paused at the front door, listening. Footsteps in the distance. Low voices. They were moving closer. The first wave came without warning. The gang, confident in numbers, tried to force their way onto his property. They shouted insults, breaking small items along the fence, trying to provoke a reaction. Most people would have run or called for help, but he did neither. He moved inside calmly, retreating to the parts of the house where he had set up observation points. Every window, every doorway had been thought through. He could see the attackers' movements before they even fully realized they were being watched. He noticed weaknesses immediately. Their coordination was sloppy in the chaos, their attention divided between intimidation and vandalism. Small mistakes appeared everywhere. Doors left slightly unlatched, shadows revealing hidden positions, loud footsteps giving away approach angles. He memorized every movement, noting patterns in timing and behavior. These weren't random thugs, they were careless, and that carelessness could be used against them. Then came the confrontation. One of the gang members attempted to climb over the fence. The man had anticipated this. He activated a small deterrent he had set up days before, something simple but effective enough to startle and slow anyone attempting an entry. The intruder froze, eyes wide with surprise, and stumbled back. His companions shouted, but he was already retreating to a more secure position inside, assessing the next move. The gang didn't expect resistance. They had assumed fear would control him. Now confusion began to creep into their behavior. They were no longer acting confidently. Instead, they hesitated, uncertain about the reactions of the man they had underestimated. Every hesitation, every wrong move, every moment of doubt worked in his favor. He stayed silent, letting them make mistakes while he quietly documented everything. Every misstep, every aggressive attempt would later serve as evidence, and as intelligence for what came next. The tension stretched on for hours. He did not leave his home, did not confront them directly, but he stayed alert. He moved silently between observation points, noting positions and probable strategies. His calm, measured demeanor was unnerving, though they could not see it. From outside, they could only hear his occasional footsteps inside the house. It was enough to unsettle them. They had thought they were confronting an ordinary man. They were discovering slowly and painfully that they were not. As night fell, he began to take the next step. He didn't act violently. That wasn't necessary yet. Instead, he created controlled situations where the gang's behavior revealed itself further. He set up lights, noise triggers, and small signs of movement that drew attention to specific areas, forcing the gang to move in ways he could predict. Their patterns became clear: who led, who followed, how they communicated silently, even how they responded to unexpected situations. Every observation sharpened his plan. He also began leaving subtle traces for law enforcement without revealing his own involvement. Photos, recorded footage from hidden cameras, and detailed notes were all collected. He understood that real power came not just from strength, but from intelligence. When the time came to act, he would have a full understanding of the enemy's behavior, numbers, and weaknesses. And he would act decisively. During these tense nights, he also reflected on his life. The skills he had acquired over years of intense training were not for show. They were discipline, precision, and patience, the kind that only came from surviving situations far more dangerous than anything the gang could imagine. He had learned long ago that strength was meaningless without control. He had learned that action without planning was wasted energy. Every instinct, every decision, every careful movement had been shaped by experience. The gang grew frustrated. Their attempts to intimidate had failed. Their confidence had shifted into confusion, then into fear, though they would never admit it to each other. They started making mistakes more frequently, splitting up when they shouldn't, shouting commands that exposed their positions, leaving behind small items that could later be traced. Their aggression had turned into chaos, and he watched quietly, silently preparing for the moment when control would shift entirely. At one point, one member tried to break a side window. He had anticipated this. He moved to a safe position inside the house, using shadows and angles to remain unseen, and quietly monitored the action. The window shattered slightly, but the man's presence was already felt in subtle ways. A noise, a shifted object, a sense of being watched. The gang member froze, looking around nervously. Small psychological strategies, carefully placed, were making a big impact. The attackers were beginning to understand that they were no longer in control. Even as he prepared for escalation, he maintained his humanity. He didn't act out of anger, nor did he seek revenge. Every move was calculated, every step measured. He thought about the broader implications of his actions, protecting himself, ensuring the safety of others, and teaching a lesson about assumptions and underestimation. Violence without purpose was not part of his plan. Precision, intelligence, and strategy were. In the days that followed, he continued to refine his preparations. He mapped escape routes, safe zones, and observation points. He reinforced physical security and developed contingency plans. But most importantly, he developed psychological strategies. The gang had relied on fear and intimidation, assuming that a lack of response meant weakness. He demonstrated quietly and deliberately that patience and observation could be far more powerful than brute force. Neighbors began to notice changes, though few understood them. Some observed him moving with unusual care, adjusting objects and positions around the house. Others whispered about the quiet determination they sensed in him. No one dared approach. They didn't understand what they were witnessing, but they could feel the growing tension. There was something different about this man, something they couldn't name, something they feared even without knowing why. The gang, meanwhile, grew increasingly desperate. Their confidence had been shattered by repeated failure to provoke a reaction. They had assumed numbers and aggression would dominate. They had assumed that fear would control him. Now they were unsure, hesitant, and increasingly reckless. Each misstep was another piece of intelligence for the man, another sign that his patience would pay off. One night, as the gang attempted another direct approach, he put a subtle plan into action. He did not confront them physically, but he used his knowledge of the environment to manipulate their movements. Small triggers, shadows, and noises guided them into predictable paths. Each action they took was anticipated. Each error further exposed their weaknesses. By the time they realized they were being carefully monitored and controlled, it was too late. They had walked into a situation designed entirely by his mind, his training, and his discipline. By the end of this part of the story, the gang had begun to realize the truth. They had underestimated him. The quiet, disciplined man they assumed was ordinary was in fact anything but. He had observed, calculated, and anticipated every move they made. His patience had become a weapon, his preparation a shield, and though he had not yet revealed the full extent of his abilities, the first hints of what he could do had become clear. The stage was now set for a deeper confrontation. The gang was vulnerable, their mistakes accumulating, their confidence shattered. The man had not yet acted with full force, but the planning, preparation, and quiet control he had maintained for weeks had positioned him to respond decisively. The next steps would not be reckless, they would be precise, deliberate, and unstoppable. In the quiet of his home, he reflected on what had happened so far. The world outside his walls had assumed he was weak, ordinary, and fearful. They had been wrong. And when the time came, they would learn exactly how dangerous calm, preparation, and discipline could be. For now he waited, knowing that patience, intelligence, and strategy would win the day. The man had waited patiently for weeks, observing the gang, analyzing their behavior, and preparing for the moment when he would need to act. His calm, quiet exterior had fooled them into thinking he was ordinary, even weak. They didn't know that the skills he had hidden for years, skills forged in some of the most dangerous situations imaginable, were ready to come to life. It started one evening when the gang returned. Emboldened and reckless, they thought the earlier confrontations had been mere warnings, that fear or confusion had slowed him. They didn't realize that every action they had taken had been recorded, analyzed, and memorized. Their mistakes had given him an advantage, a clear picture of their movements, numbers, and weaknesses. As they approached the house, the man moved with silent precision. Every movement was deliberate, every step calculated. He didn't rush. He didn't panic. Instead, he relied on muscle memory and training that had been honed over years in the most intense conditions. He had been a Navy SEAL, though no one in the neighborhood had ever guessed it. Every observation, every subtle action over the past weeks had prepared him for this exact moment. The gang began by shouting, trying to intimidate him. But he didn't respond. They thought their aggression would provoke fear. Instead, they were met with a calm, controlled presence that was unnerving in its quiet intensity. He didn't need to shout. He didn't need to attack immediately. His very composure was enough to make them hesitate. Every hesitation would be counted, every error logged in his mind for the perfect response. Inside, he moved strategically, using his knowledge of the layout and his experience in tactical situations. He positioned himself in ways that gave him maximum advantage while keeping himself unseen. Cameras and simple sensors he had installed helped him monitor the gang's movements, but his real strength lay in his own instincts. Every footstep, every glance, every shift in their posture was observed. He knew who was leading, who was hesitant, and who would react unpredictably. Then he acted, but not recklessly. He used his knowledge to create controlled situations that forced the gang into mistakes. Small obstacles, subtle sounds, and carefully timed movements guided them exactly where he wanted. Each member became part of a pattern he had designed. This was not about brute force. This was about intelligence, control, and precision. For the first time, the gang realized that they had severely underestimated him. He moved with speed and efficiency, but every action was deliberate. He didn't need to confront all of them at once. He exploited weaknesses, separated them from the group, and forced them into positions where they were exposed and vulnerable. The confusion and fear that grew in them were clear indicators that his strategies were working. Through all of this, he maintained a strong moral compass. He didn't seek unnecessary harm, didn't act out of anger, and avoided overreaction. His goal was control, protection, and ensuring that the gang could no longer terrorize the neighborhood. Every step he took was calculated to achieve that goal. He had been trained to protect, to survive, and to neutralize threats with efficiency, and now those skills were being applied in a situation much closer to home. One of the gang members tried to flee, thinking he could escape the consequences, but the man had anticipated that possibility. Using subtle tracking and careful positioning, he cornered the individual in a way that left no room for violent escalation, but ensured the person could not continue the attack. It was precise, methodical, and entirely controlled. The others watched in disbelief, realizing their assumptions had been shattered. By the time the situation reached its peak, the man had regained complete control. The gang was disoriented, frustrated, and scared. Their confidence had been replaced by fear and uncertainty. Every move they had made over the past weeks had been observed and used against them, and now they were fully exposed. The man's calmness, discipline, and tactical intelligence had completely turned the tables. During this confrontation, the man's Navy SEAL skills became clear, not just in physical prowess but in psychological control. He understood human behavior deeply, predicting reactions before they occurred. He used timing, positioning, and environmental awareness to maintain the upper hand. Every action was measured, deliberate, and controlled. This wasn't chaos. This was mastery in action. Neighbors hidden behind closed curtains watched in awe and fear. They had seen hints of his discipline and calmness before, but nothing could prepare them for the extent of his capability. The quiet man they assumed was ordinary had transformed into a figure of unmatched focus, skill, and intelligence. What had once been a simple attempt to intimidate had turned into a lesson in underestimation. Even as he controlled the situation, he remained aware of the human cost. He avoided unnecessary confrontation, ensured no innocent bystanders were harmed, and focused solely on neutralizing the threat. This was not about vengeance. This was about restoring safety and asserting control over a situation that had been growing dangerously out of hand. Every move, every calculation served a purpose. As the night wore on, the gang's last attempts at aggression failed. They were disorganized, confused, and powerless. The man had turned their overconfidence into their downfall. They began to retreat, humiliated and aware that they had underestimated someone they thought they could intimidate. They left, some running, others limping from minor controlled setbacks designed to stop them without unnecessary harm. Afterward, the man walked through his home, inspecting every detail. Nothing had been damaged beyond repair. The preparations he had made, combined with his skills and strategic actions, had preserved both his safety and his property. He documented everything carefully, photos, notes, observations, ensuring that law enforcement would have evidence if needed. This was not only tactical, it was responsible and methodical. Sitting quietly afterward, he reflected on what had occurred. The experience had reminded him of the value of patience, discipline, and careful observation. He had been provoked, tested, and challenged, yet he had maintained control throughout. Every decision had been deliberate, every action purposeful. He understood the dangers of impulsive behavior and the importance of measured responses. The neighborhood slowly began to change after that night. Fear of the gang replaced by caution, then by respect. Neighbors whispered about the man they had once seen as quiet and ordinary, now recognizing that appearances could be deceiving. Some offered quiet thanks. Others simply observed from a distance, understanding instinctively that this man was not to be underestimated. But despite the resolution, he did not change. He returned to his routines, maintaining the calm exterior that had kept him safe. Mowing the lawn, watering the garden, reading quietly in the evenings, all ordinary actions masking extraordinary capability. He knew the world could never be entirely safe, that threats could arise anywhere, but he also knew that preparedness, discipline, and intelligence were his greatest allies. In the following days, He continued to reinforce his home and strategies not out of fear, but out of wisdom. He remained vigilant, observing the neighborhood, ensuring that no remnants of the gang returned. His calm control had not only protected him but also sent a clear message. Aggression without understanding can be disastrous. And those who had assumed he was ordinary had learned a lesson they would not forget. Even as the immediate threat faded, he reflected on his own identity. For years he had hidden his skills, lived quietly, and allowed others to underestimate him. Now circumstances had forced a revelation. Yet he remained humble, knowing that true strength was not about recognition or display, but about discipline, strategy, and moral responsibility. He had acted decisively when necessary, and now the neighborhood would live in the aftermath of those actions, safer and more aware. By the end of this part of the story, the man had fully demonstrated his capability, the gang had been neutralized, the home secured, and the neighborhood tension reduced. Yet the quiet man remained the same outwardly, disciplined, calm, and observant. Beneath the surface, however, he was a force shaped by experience, training, and an unyielding sense of control. The stage was now set for the final resolution. The immediate threat had passed, but the lessons learned, the strategies applied, and the calm authority displayed would define the neighborhood for years to come. And the man, though unassuming in appearance, had proven that true strength often lies hidden beneath a quiet exterior. After the confrontation, the neighborhood slowly began to settle. The gang, humiliated and disoriented, had retreated completely, and there were no signs of them returning. The quiet streets, once filled with tension and unease, gradually regained a sense of calm. People walked a little more freely, children played outside without fear, and neighbors exchanged cautious greetings. Yet a subtle awareness lingered. Everyone seemed to know, even if they didn't speak of it, that something extraordinary had happened in their midst. The man went about his life as usual, tending to his home, maintaining his routines, and quietly observing the changes around him. From the outside, nothing seemed different. He mowed the lawn, watered the garden, and went about daily chores with the same disciplined calm as before. But inside, he reflected on what had transpired, processing the lessons learned and the strategies employed. He knew that vigilance and awareness would always be necessary, even when immediate threats had passed. Over the following days, he reinforced his home further, not out of fear, but out of wisdom and careful preparation. Locks were checked, weak points were reinforced, and hidden observation points were refined. He understood that life could change in an instant, that danger could arise without warning, and that preparedness was not a burden, but a responsibility. He had lived through situations far more perilous than this, and he knew the value of caution and foresight. Neighbors began to approach him more frequently, though still with a mix of curiosity and cautious respect. Some expressed quiet thanks, others simply observed him from a distance, sensing the discipline and strength that radiated from his calm demeanor. They did not fully understand what had happened, nor could they imagine the full extent of his skills, but they sensed that the man they once assumed to be ordinary was, in fact, far from it. He accepted their gratitude quietly, never seeking recognition or praise. True strength, he knew, was not about showing power or boasting of one's capabilities. It was about discipline, awareness, and the ability to act decisively when necessary. He had neutralized the threat without unnecessary violence, protected his home and neighbors, and maintained control throughout. That to him was the measure of success. As he moved through his home, he noticed small signs of the gang's retreat. Objects they had left behind, minor traces of their presence, all carefully documented, would serve as evidence if law enforcement needed it. He had not relied solely on physical confrontation. Intelligence, observation, and strategy had been equally important. By the time anyone arrived to investigate, he would have a complete record, clear and precise, of everything that had occurred. For the first time in weeks, he allowed himself to relax slightly. Sitting on his porch as the sun dipped behind the trees, he reflected on the tension and fear that had gripped the neighborhood. He thought about the assumptions people made, how appearances could deceive, and how easily ignorance could fuel conflict. He had experienced it firsthand, and he had responded with patience, strategy, and careful action. The quiet man who once kept to himself had become a symbol, though not intentionally. Neighbors began to see him differently, not as someone to fear, but as someone who commanded respect. His calm, deliberate presence had conveyed strength without words. It was a lesson in perception, discipline, and the quiet power that comes from experience and preparation. Despite the resolution, he remained aware that life could always present new challenges. Danger did not always announce itself, and the skills he had relied on could be called upon again at any time. He maintained his vigilance not out of obsession, but out of a clear understanding of reality. Preparedness was a way of life, not a temporary state. He also reflected on the personal journey he had undertaken. Weeks of observation, patience, and calculated action had tested his limits in new ways. He had relied on his training, his discipline, and his ability to remain calm under pressure. Each step, each decision, each calculated move reinforced the lessons he had learned long ago. Control, strategy, and careful planning were more powerful than fear or aggression. In the neighborhood, life gradually returned to a more normal rhythm. Children played freely, people greeted each other with renewed warmth, and the tension that had filled the streets was replaced by cautious optimism. Yet the subtle shift in awareness remained. Those who had witnessed, even partially, the calm authority and intelligence of the man had learned something important. Strength and capability are not always visible, and true power often lies hidden beneath a quiet exterior. He continued to live quietly, engaging with his community in measured ways. He volunteered when needed, offered assistance discreetly, and maintained the routines that had once made him blend into the background. Yet beneath this ordinary facade was a man shaped by extraordinary experience, whose calm, calculated presence could respond to any threat with precision. The neighborhood began to speak in whispers about the events. Stories circulated, some exaggerated, some accurate. Yet even in rumor there was a consistent theme. A quiet man had faced a dangerous threat and neutralized it with skill, intelligence, and restraint. Those who had once dismissed him now observed him with a mix of respect and awe. They understood without fully knowing that he had acted decisively and successfully to protect both himself and others. He did not seek recognition. His satisfaction came from the knowledge that the neighborhood was safer, that the threat had been eliminated, and that he had maintained control throughout. The skills he had once hidden, the discipline he had cultivated, and the experience he had accumulated had all converged at the right moment. That convergence had turned a dangerous situation into a controlled resolution. Even as life returned to a more ordinary rhythm, he continued to refine his skills and preparations. Observation, vigilance, and strategy remained a part of his daily life. He understood that the world was unpredictable and that preparedness was not something temporary. It was a mindset, a way of approaching life with clarity, calm, and careful attention. Neighbors began to respect the quiet boundaries he maintained. They understood that he was not someone to be tested or provoked, and that calm and observation could be more powerful than aggression. Over time, the tension in the community eased further. People who had once acted recklessly or with hostility began to behave more cautiously. The neighborhood, in subtle ways, had changed. He also reflected on the importance of patience and restraint. Weeks of observation had been crucial to achieving control without unnecessary conflict. His calm demeanor, careful preparation, and precise action had neutralized the threat effectively. He understood that discipline, not anger or impulse, was the key to handling dangerous situations. As days turned into weeks, the quiet man continued his routines, maintaining his home, observing the streets, and quietly engaging with neighbors. The neighborhood had stabilized, but he remained aware that vigilance was always necessary. Preparedness, intelligence, and awareness were not optional. They were essential. In moments of reflection, he considered how easily assumptions could mislead people. The gang had assumed weakness where there was strength, fear where there was calm, and ordinariness where there was extraordinary experience. He had turned those assumptions against them, demonstrating that patience, observation, and strategy were more powerful than aggression or intimidation. The quiet man's life returned to its rhythm, but he had changed as well. The confrontation had reaffirmed the value of discipline, preparation, and moral responsibility. He had acted decisively when necessary, protected his home and community, and maintained control throughout. The lessons learned would remain with him forever, guiding his actions in ways both visible and invisible to others. The neighborhood, though calmer, carried the memory of what had happened. People understood, at least on some level, that appearances could be deceiving. The quiet man, who had once been just another resident, had become a figure of discipline, intelligence, and controlled power. His actions had reshaped the way the community viewed strength, danger, and the value of preparation. Even in moments of peace, he remained vigilant. Life could change in an instant, and threats could arise where least expected. He had learned through experience that calm, intelligence, and careful observation were the greatest tools in responding to danger. His quiet life, though seemingly ordinary, was in fact a life prepared for anything. In the end, the man returned to his routines, tending his home, maintaining his garden, and engaging with the community in subtle, thoughtful ways. He had restored safety, neutralized the threat, and demonstrated the power of calm, preparation, and intelligence. The neighborhood was safer, the gang was gone, and the quiet man continued to live as he always had, with discipline, focus, and careful awareness. His story became one of silent strength, a reminder that true power does not need to be announced and that calm, prepared individuals can face danger with intelligence and control. The neighborhood learned in their own way that appearances can be deceiving, and that the quietest people sometimes carry the greatest strength. Even after everything had passed, the man remained vigilant. Life returned to its ordinary rhythm, but he knew that the lessons of patience, preparation, and strategic action would always guide him. The neighborhood had been tested, he had acted decisively, and the quiet balance of discipline and intelligence had prevailed. And so life continued, calm on the surface, but underpinned by the strength of a man who knew the value of patience, strategy, and unwavering focus. The gang had been defeated, the neighborhood was safe, and the quiet man remained, as always, ready for whatever life might bring next.